Elvis Presley's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, wasn't actually a colonel, wasn't named Tom Parker, and wasn't even American. He was an illegal immigrant living in constant fear. Offers reaching millions of dollars, astronomical sums for the time, were made for Elvis to perform just one show overseas. Yet they were consistently refused, without clear explanation. Despite being arguably the most famous person on the planet, Elvis Presley only ever performed 3 concerts outside the United States, all in Canada, in 1957, very early in his career, and never ventured overseas. Security fears for the king of rock and roll were so intense that even domestic appearances required massive operations, raising questions about how safety could ever be guaranteed abroad. In his final years, Elvis's declining health made grueling U.S. tours incredibly difficult, let alone globe-spanning ones. Number 5. The mind-boggling security nightmare. Imagine being the most famous person on Earth. Not just famous, like a movie star today, but phenomenon famous. Like Beatlemania, but centered on one single, electrifying man. That was Elvis Presley in his prime, and even well into the 1970s. The sheer magnetic pull he had on people was unprecedented and frankly terrifying for anyone tasked with keeping him safe. Now imagine trying to manage that level of global hysteria in countries far from home, with different laws, different security protocols, and unfamiliar territories. It wasn't just a worry. It was a logistical and security nightmare of epic proportions, and it looms large as a potential factor in why Elvis remained stateside. Think about the scenes from his early career. Newsreels and photographs show fans literally ripping his clothes, mobbing his cars, fainting in droves. Police forces were often overwhelmed. Riots sometimes broke out simply because Elvis was in town. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the norm wherever he went in the United States. His appearances required meticulous planning. Cordons of police, private security teams, secret entrances and exits, and decoy vehicles. Even with all that breaches happened, fans would find ways to get to him, driven by an adoration that bordered on obsession. Now, transplant that scenario to London, Paris, Tokyo, Sydney, or anywhere else outside North America. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, was known for his meticulous control over every aspect of Elvis's career, and security was undoubtedly a massive part of that. He would have considered the risks involved in taking his prize asset, the man who generated millions, into environments where Parker perhaps had less control, less familiarity, and fewer direct connections with local law enforcement or security apparatuses. Consider the guiling climate of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The Cold War was raging. Political tensions were high in many parts of the world. While Elvis was generally seen as an apolitical entertainer, the sheer size of the crowds he would draw could be seen as a potential security risk by foreign governments, or even a target. Kidnapping threats against celebrities and their families were a real concern. Elvis himself reportedly faced numerous threats over his career, including death threats. Taking him overseas would exponentially increase the complexity of managing these risks. Who could be trusted? How could local authorities guarantee his safety when faced with potentially tens or hundreds of thousands of frenzied fans? Furthermore, the logistics of moving Elvis and his considerable entourage, band, backup singers, crew, management, personal companions, the Memphis Mafia, securely across continents, were daunting. Every airport arrival, every hotel stay, every trip to a venue would be a massive security operation. In the US, Parker had established methods, trusted contacts, and a degree of predictability. Overseas, it was all unknown variables. Think about the equipment alone. An Elvis show, especially in the jumpsuit era, was a huge production. Sound systems, lighting rigs, instruments, elaborate stage costumes, all needed to be transported safely and securely. Any disruption, any security lapse involving the equipment or the personnel could jeopardize a multi-million-dollar tour. Could local security forces handle it? In the 1950s and 60s, international event security wasn't the sophisticated, globally coordinated industry it is today. Techniques were less advanced, communication between different national agencies potentially more complicated. Parker, ever the cautious, some would say controlling, manager, might have looked at the situation and deemed the risks simply too high. Why gamble with Elvis's safety, and by extension his own livelihood, when they were already earning vast sums of money through records, movies, and US performances? Specific incidents, even minor ones, could have fueled these fears. Reports exist of close calls even within the US, moments where crowd control nearly failed. Elvis himself sometimes seemed unnerved by the sheer intensity of the crowds. While he undoubtedly loved his fans, the potential for things to get out of hand was always present. Extrapolating that to an unfamiliar foreign setting potentially, with language barriers adding to the confusion, presented a chilling scenario. Could Elvis have been successfully protected on a world tour? Almost certainly, with enough resources and planning. Other major stars did travel internationally, but the scale of Elvis mania was unique. The perception of risk, particularly through the lens of a hyper-controlling manager like Colonel Parker, might have been inflated to the point where it became a convenient and plausible reason to keep the king safely within the borders of the United States and, briefly, Canada. The potential for chaos, injury, or worse, on foreign soil was a powerful deterrent, a factual consideration that could not be ignored by anyone responsible for the well-being of the biggest star in the world. The sheer potential for uncontrollable mayhem abroad was a stark, factual consideration. Number 4. The king's own declining health. While the image of Elvis Presley often remains frozen in time, as the young, electrifying rebel of the 1950s or the manic, jumpsuit-clad Vegas performer, the reality of his later years paints a different picture. By the mid to late 1970s, the period when massive international tour offers were still rolling in, Elvis was battling significant health problems. These weren't minor issues. They were serious, chronic conditions, exacerbated by a grueling lifestyle and a dependence on prescription medications. This documented decline in his physical well-being presents a compelling, factual reason why embarking on a demanding overseas tour would have been incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for him. Let's be clear about the timeline. The calls for Elvis to tour internationally never really stopped, from the late 50s right up until his death in 1977. However, the feasibility of such a tour changed dramatically over time, largely due to his health. In the 1970s, Elvis was locked into a demanding schedule, primarily focused on Las Vegas residencies and short tours across the United States. These performances, while often still brilliant, were taking an increasing toll. Accounts from band members, friends, and even medical records paint a concerning picture. Elvis suffered from a range of ailments, many of which were serious and debilitating. He battled high blood pressure, issues with his colon, including megacolon, glaucoma, affecting his eyesight particularly under bright stage lights, liver problems, and respiratory issues. His weight fluctuated dramatically, often ballooning significantly, which put further strain on his heart and body. He often performed while unwell, pushing himself through pain and fatigue. Central to these health struggles was his reliance on a vast cocktail of prescription drugs. Doctors prescribed medications for sleep, pain, energy, mood, and various other conditions. Over time, this dependency spiraled, leading to erratic behavior, slurred speech on occasion, difficulty waking up, and periods of apparent confusion or lethargy. Members of his entourage often had the difficult task of ensuring he was awake, coherent, and physically capable of getting to the stage each night, even on domestic tours. Now, consider the demands of an international tour. It's not just the performances themselves. It's the constant travel across time zones, the unfamiliar food and water, the different climates, the disruption of routine, the stress of navigating new environments, and the sheer physical exhaustion of being on day after day in foreign countries. For a man already struggling to keep up with his U.S. schedule, whose health was visibly declining, the prospect of adding the immense strain of international travel seems almost unthinkable. Imagine the scenario, flying Elvis, along with his entire entourage and medical support, which was reportedly significant even on U.S. tours, across the Atlantic or Pacific, dealing with jet lag, while needing to be rested and medicated correctly for performances, ensuring access to the specific foods he required. Elvis had notoriously particular eating habits and, crucially, managing his complex medication regimen in different countries with potentially different regulations. What if he had a medical emergency far from his regular doctors and the controlled environment of Graceland or his Vegas suites? There are documented instances during his 70s U.S. tours where Elvis had to cancel shows due to illness, sometimes spending days recuperating in hotel rooms. He was hospitalized several times. On stage, while often still delivering powerful performances, fueled by adrenaline and sheer will, there were nights where his fatigue was evident, his voice showing strain. Adding multiple international flights, customs procedures, language barriers, and the general wear and tear of global travel to this already precarious situation would have been incredibly taxing. Colonel Parker, ever protective of his golden goose, would have been acutely aware of Elvis's physical limitations, even if he publicly maintained the image of the indefatigable king. While Parker's own reasons for avoiding international travel might have been primary, more on that later, Elvis's health provided a very real, very concerning, and entirely factual justification for keeping him closer to home. It wasn't just about comfort. It was about basic health management and the very real fear that a grueling overseas schedule could push Elvis beyond his physical limits. Could a specially managed tour, with extended rests, top-tier medical support on hand 24/7, and a carefully controlled environment, have been possible perhaps? But the risks were undeniable. For a man whose body was already showing the severe strain of years of relentless performing and punishing health habits, the physical demands of a world tour in the mid to late 1970s presented a formidable factual barrier. His body was, quite simply, struggling to keep up even with the domestic pace. An international tour might have been too much for the king to bear. Number 3. The sheer scale of logistics and money. And maybe not needing it? Taking the Elvis Presley show on the road in the United States was already a monumental undertaking, a rolling circus of personnel, equipment, and meticulous planning. Scaling that up for an international tour in the 1960s or 70s presented logistical and financial hurdles that were almost unimaginably complex for the time. While Elvis could undoubtedly command huge fees anywhere in the world, the sheer cost, complexity, and perhaps Colonel Parker's assessment of the necessity of such ventures stand as a significant factual reason for why they never materialized beyond those 3 Canadian shows in 1957. First, consider the sheer size of the operation. By the 1970s, an Elvis concert wasn't just Elvis and a guitar. It involved a large rock band, like the TCB Band, multiple backup singers, like the Sweet Inspirations and J.D. Sumner and the Stamps Quartet, an orchestra for some shows, sound engineers, lighting technicians, roadies, wardrobe staff, management per staff, management's own entourage, the Memphis Mafia, and Elvis's own entourage. This was dozens, if not hundreds of people who needed transportation, accommodation, food, and work permits for international travel. Then there was the equipment. State-of-the-art sound systems, complex lighting rigs, instruments, stage platforms, generators, and Elvis's increasingly elaborate wardrobe, those heavy jeweled jumpsuits. All of this had to be packed, shipped internationally, a far slower and more expensive process than today. Clear customs be transported overland to venues, set up, torn down, and moved to the next city. The cost of air freight or sea freight for tons of delicate and expensive gear would have been astronomical. Endurance alone would be a massive expense. Colonel Parker was known for driving a hard bargain. He demanded and got unprecedented fees and percentages for Elvis's performances, while offers poured in from promoters around the world, often promising record-breaking sums. Reports mention figures like $1 million for a single show in the Middle East, a staggering amount at the time. Parker's counter-demands were often perceived as deliberately prohibitive. He might ask for such an enormous guarantee, such a high percentage of the gate plus coverage of all logistical costs up front, that it became financially unviable or simply too risky for foreign promoters. Was this a negotiation tactic, or a way to ensure the tours never actually happened without directly saying no? The fact is, these potentially lucrative deals consistently fell through, often citing Parker's demands. Parker had also engineered a highly profitable and relatively predictable system within the United States, particularly with the Las Vegas residencies. Starting in 1969, Elvis performed extended engagements at the International Hotel, later the Las Vegas Hilton. These deals were groundbreaking, guaranteeing Elvis millions of dollars for performing multiple weeks in one location. This minimized travel costs, security headaches, and logistical complexity compared to a touring show. Parker had a controlled environment, a guaranteed paycheck, and a massive built-in audience. Supplementing this with short, high-grossing U.S. tours kept the money rolling in with manageable effort and risk. From a purely financial perspective, Parker's main focus, did Elvis need to tour internationally? His records sold globally by the millions, reaching #1 in charts across the world, without him ever setting foot in those countries, post-1957. His movies were international hits. His 1973 Aloha from Hawaii concert was broadcast live via satellite to over 40 countries, reaching an estimated audience of over 1 billion people, a pioneering global media event. Elvis was a worldwide phenomenon without physically traveling the world. Parker might have calculated that the immense cost, complexity, and potential risks of international touring simply didn't offer enough additional financial benefit compared to the guaranteed lower-risk income streams they already had. Why spend millions shipping gear and personnel overseas dealing with foreign taxes, currency exchange, unpredictable local logistics, and potential security nightmares when you could rake in millions staying in Vegas or doing a quick run through major U.S. cities? The Aloha Special proved you could reach a global audience from one location, leveraging technology instead of airplanes. The logistical mountain was real. Coordinating international flights for a huge group, booking suitable hotels capable of handling the security and demands of Elvis's entourage, arranging secure ground transport, navigating work visas, and permits, ensuring Tectari Suri. Compared to booking a block of rooms at the Las Vegas Hilton and driving trucks across state lines, it was a different universe of difficulty. So, while the allure of conquering the world stage physically must have been there, the sheer daunting factual obstacles of logistics and finance, coupled with Parker's potentially inflated demands and the existence of highly profanation domestic alternatives, provide a compelling explanation for why the King's Kingdom remained largely confined to North America. The mountain of moving the Elvis show overseas was, factually, enormous. Number 2. The King's comfort zone and Parker's iron grip. While external factors like security, health, and logistics played undeniable roles, we also have to consider the personal elements, Elvis's own personal parity and preferences, intertwined with Colonel Parker's legendary control over his life and career. Elvis Presley, despite his global fame, was known to be a creature of habit deeply attached to his home, Graceland, and surrounded by his close-knit group of friends and employees, the Memphis Mafia. This comfort zone, combined with Parker's absolute determination to manage every facet of Elvis's world, forms another factual layer explaining the lack of international tours. Elvis loved Graceland. It was his sanctuary, his escape from the pressures of fame. He invested heavily in it, customizing it to his tastes, and it remained his primary home base throughout his adult life. Accounts from those close to him consistently describe him as happiest when he was at home in Memphis, surrounded by familiar faces, able to relax as much as Elvis ever could in his own environment. He enjoyed his routines, his specific foods, his late-night activities, all easier to maintain within his own domain. International travel, by its very nature, disrupts routine. It involves unfamiliar surroundings, different foods, strange beds, and being far from the grounding influence of home. While Elvis traveled extensively within the U.S. for tours and movie shoots, especially earlier in his career, the prospect of being continents away for extended periods might simply not have appealed to him, particularly as he got older. He had his specific needs and comforts, from peanut butter and banana sandwiches prepared just so, to having his friends constantly around him. Replicating this precise environment overseas would have been challenging. Was Elvis himself actively opposed to touring abroad? It's hard to say definitively, as Parker filtered so much of the information and decision-making. There are reports that Elvis expressed interest in seeing places like Europe or Japan, that he was aware of his massive fan base overseas and sometimes wondered about performing for them. However, there's little evidence he ever seriously pushed the issue against Parker's resistance. Elvis placed immense trust in the Colonel, who had guided him from regional sensation to global superstar. Parker handled the business. Elvis handled the performing. For much of his career, Elvis seemed content, or at least resigned, to letting Parker make the big decisions about where and when he worked. This deference played directly into Parker's control. The colonel was notorious for isolating Elvis, managing who had access to him, and controlling the flow of information. If Parker didn't want Elvis to tour internationally, for his own reasons, he could easily manage the situation by emphasizing the difficulties, the security risks, the logistical hassles, the potential health strains, the complexities of foreign contracts, perhaps exaggerating them to ensure Elvis didn't push the matter. He could frame it as protecting Elvis's best interests, keeping him safe and comfortable. Parker's control extended to nearly every area. He negotiated every deal, approved every public appearance, and managed Elvis's finances, taking a famously high commission, sometimes reportedly up to 50%. This level of control would be harder to maintain on foreign soil. Parker would be dealing with unfamiliar promoters, different legal systems, and potentially less direct influence over local arrangements. Staying within the U.S., especially in the controlled environments of Las Vegas or on carefully planned domestic tours, allowed Parker to keep his iron grip firmly in place. An international tour represented uncertainty, a potential loosening of that total control which Parker seemed constitutionally averse to. Furthermore, the Memphis Mafia, Elvis's ever-present entourage, played a role. These were his friends, his companions, his buffer against the outside world. They traveled with him everywhere in the U.S., organizing passports, visas, and international travel for this entire group added another layer of complexity, but more importantly, Elvis relied on their familiar presence. Parker knew this and managed the group dynamic carefully, keeping the whole operation within the U.S. simplified, managing this extended family as well. So, while Elvis might have occasionally dreamed of seeing the Eiffel Tower or performing for his Japanese fans, his documented love for the comforts of home and his deep-seated reliance on Colonel Parker's judgment created a situation where staying put was the path of least resistance. Parker, leveraging his absolute control and likely emphasizing all the negative aspects of international travel, security, health, logistics, could effectively ensure that Elvis remained within his carefully managed American kingdom. Elvis's preference for the familiar, combined with Parker's need for control, formed a powerful fact-based inertia, keeping the king from venturing overseas. Number 1. Colonel Parker's secret identity and illegal status. This is the reason that often overshadows all others the potentially explosive secret held by Elvis's lifelong manager, Colonel Tom Parker. It's a fact as bizarre and compelling as Elvis's own story. Colonel Parker wasn't Colonel Parker. He wasn't even American. He was in fact born Andreas Cornelis van Kooijake in Breda, Netherlands, and he entered the United States illegally in 1929. This undocumented status and the lifelong fear of exposure and potential deportation it engendered is widely considered the single most significant factual barrier preventing Elvis Presley from ever touring internationally. Andreas van Kooijake arrived in America as a young man, likely slipping off a ship. He soon enlisted in the U.S. Army, adopting the name Tom Parker from one of his officers. While he served for a few years, he never obtained legal citizenship. The honorary title colonel came much later, bestowed upon him in 1948 by Jimmy Davis, the governor of Louisiana, for political campaign work. It held no military rank. For his entire adult life in America, Parker lived under an assumed identity with no legal right to be in the country. This fundamental fact had profound implications for his ability to travel internationally. To leave the United States, Parker would have needed a passport. To get a U.S. passport, he would have needed proof of citizenship, which he did not have and could not obtain without revealing his illegal entry and potentially facing deportation back to the Netherlands. If he were to travel outside the U.S., using some other means, highly unlikely and risky, he would face U.S. immigration upon trying to return. Without a valid visa or proof of legal residency, he would almost certainly be denied re-entry. Losing access to the United States meant losing access to Elvis Presley, his sole massive source of income and influence. Parker had built his entire life and fortune around managing Elvis. Being barred from the U.S. would mean the end of his career, the collapse of his carefully constructed world. Therefore, leaving the country was a risk he was seemingly unwilling to take under any circumstances. This fear explains so much of Parker's behavior regarding international tour offers. Why would he allegedly make outrageous financial demands that no promoter could meet? It was a way to scuttle the deal without revealing the real reason he couldn't go. Why focus so heavily on lucrative long-term deals within the U.S., like the Las Vegas residencies? They kept Elvis accessible and profitable without Parker ever needing to risk exposure at a border crossing. Why the intense focus on security and control? It minimized the chances of any outside entity digging too deeply into Parker's background. There are numerous anecdotes supporting this. People who worked with Parker noted his extreme reluctance to deal with anything involving official government, paperwork, or travel outside the U.S. When the U.S. Army sought to send Elvis to Germany for his military service in 1958, Parker did not accompany him, citing business reasons. While Elvis performed his only non-U.S. shows in Canada in 1957, Parker could travel there and back without needing a passport at that time. Border controls between the U.S. and Canada were less stringent then. However, travel to Europe, Asia, Australia, or South America would have been impossible for him without revealing his secret. Even the pioneering Aloha from Hawaii satellite broadcast in 1973 can be viewed through this lens. Hawaii, being a U.S. state, required no passport for Parker. Yet, the broadcast reached a massive global audience, effectively giving Elvis an international appearance, without Parker having to confront his immigration problem. It was a clever way to achieve global reach while staying safely within U.S. territory. Did Elvis know the truth about Parker's origins and illegal status? It's uncertain. Some accounts suggest Elvis was unaware, while others hint that he might have known or suspected something later in his life, but felt trapped in the relationship or simply deferred to Parker's judgment as always. Regardless of whether Elvis knew, Parker's situation was a hard factual constraint. The possibility of Parker's past in the Netherlands holding more secrets also exists. There has been speculation, including a Dutch investigation years later, linking Parker as Van Cuyjeke to an unsolved murder case in his hometown shortly before he fled to America. While Parker was never charged and definitive proof is lacking, the possibility that he fled something more serious than just lack of opportunity could have added another powerful layer to his fear of ever being forced to return or having his true identity exposed. This remains speculation, but the fact of his illegal entry and assumed identity is well documented. Ultimately, Colonel Tom Parker's life in America was built on a foundation of secrecy regarding his origins. Protecting that secret was paramount. International travel posed a direct threat to that secret. Therefore, ensuring that his multi-million-dollar client, Elvis Presley, never embarked on tours that would require Parker's own international travel, became a necessity for the Colonel's own survival and continued success. This hidden vulnerability of the man pulling the strings provides the most compelling, deeply intriguing, and fact-based reason why the king of rock and roll, despite his global adoration, never conquered the world stage in person. The Colonel couldn't leave, so the king didn't either.